For this exercise, we're going to take a look at how to account for bonds. So let's assume that we have a bond that has a face value of 100,000. And it's a 5-year bond. And the stated rate, so that's the rate that's on the face of the bond. And the stated rate is also the rate in which the bond pays. So that's the amount that a bondholder will receive on the interest payment date. And let's assume that the stated rate is 6% and interest is paid twice a year, June 30th and December 31st. So it pays twice a year. So it's called a semi-annual interest payment. Now, we're going to assume that the bond was issued and sold on July 1st, 2011. And the maturity date is June 30th, 2016. That means that this is a 5-year bond. Now, what's another important information to note when calculating bonds is the market rate. And the market rate happens to be not equal to the stated rate, and it's 8%. Okay, so let's assume that the sample company issued a bond. The face value is 100,000. And the bond is a 5-year bond, so you can see that it was sold on July 1st and matures on June 30th. The stated rate is the rate that's on the face of the bond, and that pays at 6%. And it pays twice a year, June and December. And the market rate is 8%. So first we need to determine whether the bond is issued at a premium or a discount. And the only way for us to know that is we know that if market rate, which is 8%, is greater than the stated rate, which in this case is 6%, then we know that the bonds are issued at a discount. Now, what does that mean? It means that because our bond only pays 6%, and everybody else pays, the market rate is at 8%, to make our bonds attractive to any buyer. So for sample company to sell the bonds and to be competitive, they've got to be able to issue these bonds not at face value, but at a discounted amount. So in other words, bondholders will pay less than the face value because they're getting less on the interest amount, interest payment. Now, because the bonds are paid twice a year, the number period of compounding is going to be 10 periods. Not 10 years, 10 periods. Because we need to compound the bond twice a year because it pays twice a year. Now, the stated rate is 6%. Usually the rates are given to you on an annual basis. So we know that we need to divide this by 2 to determine the amount paid each 6 months. And the same thing with the market rate. So this is the market rate, the compounding. So the first part is we need to calculate the issue price of the bond. Now, if this was paid at 8% and the stated rate is 8 and this was 8 market rate, then you know that when you calculate the issue price, it's going to be issued at par, at face value. But because the rates are different, we need to calculate what would be the price that 80 typical investor would be willing to pay for these bonds, because these bonds are paid or the interest is less than the market rate. So to do that, we need to first calculate the present value of the principal. So the P, in this case, is 100,000 times, we want n equals 10 because there's 10 periods of compounding, and we're always present value using market rate. In this case, market rate is 4% because it's compounded twice a year, which means that the market rate is 8% divided by 2. And if I look at the time value money table, that's actually table 1, is 0.6756. That's the present value of a single amount. That gives me 67,560. Step 2 is we need to calculate the interest payment. And to calculate the interest payment is going to be 100,000 times the stated rate, which is 6%, and we're going to pay it twice a year, so divided by 2 to give us $3,000. Then step C is we're going to present value the annuity, the interest payment. It's an annuity because the payments are the same for 10 periods. So we're going to use table 2, the annuity table. It's 3,000 times n equals 10. And again, we're always using the market rate to present value. And the annuity factor is 8.1109. And that gives us 24,332,332.70. So the sum of these two should be the issue price, 91,892.70. Now, this number is less than the face value of 100, and that difference of 8,107.30, that's the discount. So in other words, a bondholder is willing to buy these series of payments for $91,000, and it's going to be less than the face value because the market rate pays at 8%, but these bonds only pay 6%. So that difference in the interest rate is what we consider the discount amount. Now, normally we're asked to record an entry. So first we need to calculate the amount of discount. And on July 1st, 2011, we're going to record the issuance of bonds. And this is from the point of view of the bond issuer, the borrower. So first we're going to debit cash for the amount that we receive, which is the issue price. And that was the calculated amount, $91,892.70. We always credit the bonds payable, which is a long-term liability, always at face value. That's $100,000. And to balance this entry, we need another debit, and we're going to call that discounts on bonds payable. I'm going to short form discount to DISC on bonds payable, and that is $81,0730. Now the discount is considered a contra account to the bonds payable. So if we were to do a financial statement presentation, as at June 30th, 2011, or July 1st, 2011, under long-term liability section of the balance sheet, we're going to have a bonds payable Normally you put down the word 6%, which is the stated rate, comma, matures June 30th, 2016 for the face value, less discounts on bonds payable, 8107.30. Now, that will be our liability. Now, there's no current portion because the way bonds work is that the bond holder, the lender, is going to receive interest payment every 6 months, and at the end of the 5-year period, it's going to receive the principal amount. So that's why there's no current portion of the $100,000. Unlike notes payable, where you've seen before, where some portion of that notes payable is due in the current period. So that's the financial statement presentation. Couple points to note. Because the bonds are issued at a discount, the amount of liability is going to be $91,000, the net. But over time, over the 5 years, what's going to happen is we're going to amortize this discounts on bonds payable. We're going to make that 8107 go down to 0, increasing the liability to the $100,000. So if you're issuing bond at a discount, what you're going to see each period as we amortize this discount is we're going to have a remaining liability of $100,000, and of course at the maturity we're going to pay out the $100,000. Now, normally what happens then is on December 31st we need to record an interest payment. So let's say we need to record the December 31st, 2011 interest entry. Now, under GAAP, under IFRS, the only method of choice is to use the effective interest method to amortize the discount and premium. But in our case, it's a discount, right? But you could also, it could have been a premium as well. Under ASPE, Accounting Standard for Private Enterprise, we do have an option to use effective interest rate method, which is EIM method, or can use straight line method if the amount, the interest amount, is not going to significantly be different under this method as opposed to EIM. So as long as the amount is not materially different, then under ASPE it will allow companies to use the much easier method called the straight line method. So we're going to actually use the effective interest rate method. So for December 31st, we need to determine the interest expense. So under the EIM method, the first thing we need to do is we need to calculate the interest expense. And to calculate the interest expense for December 31st, 2011, we need to determine the last time interest was paid. And the last time interest was paid was the date of issuance. We never paid interest. So we need to calculate the liability amount from the last time interest was paid. In our case, because the bonds were issued on July 1st, then that would be the carrying value that we need to calculate. The carrying value is bonds payable was $100,000. less discounts on bonds payable, which is 8107.30. This is the carrying value the last time interest was paid. And remember, we never paid interest because this is the first interest payment. But you'll see how we're going to calculate the next interest payment in a minute. We're going to multiply this carrying value, which is our liability, times 8%, which is market rate, divided by 2, because it's paid twice a year. Remember, we're only calculating for 6 months here. To give us the interest expense of $36.75.71. So under the effective interest rate method, you always have to calculate the interest expense. And that calculation requires us to determine the carrying value of the liability from the last time interest was paid. In our case, because this is the first payment, it would be the issue price of the bond. And we're going to multiply always by market rate. So we're going to debit interest expense for $36.75.71, which is the calculated amount. We always credit cash because that's the payment. And that payment is the stated rate, the 100,000 times 6% times 1/2. So that's $3,000. And you can see the entry doesn't balance. And the reason why it doesn't balance is because we need to record the amortization of this bond discount. And this is the credit discounts on bonds payable. Remember, the discounts on bonds payable is a debit balance. If you remember, we recorded this is a credit balance, this is a debit balance. And what we're doing, we're going to amortize. We're going to make that debit balance decrease to 0 at maturity. That's why we're crediting a portion of that. So this is our December 31st entry, our first interest entry. Now, what happens with the financial statement presentation as at December 31st, 2011? Again, enter long-term liability section. We're going to have bonds payable, comma, 6%, comma, matures June 30th, 2016. We're going to show the 100,000. This time, we're going to show less discounts on bonds payable. And this time, we're going to show not the 8107. It's going to be 8107.30, which was, if you recall, that was the presentation as of June. But that one, we're going to subtract the 675. And this is 7431.59. So our liability is 92,568.41. And you notice the liability is getting bigger, larger, higher. Okay? So the key takeaway here is that if bonds are issued at a discount, the carrying value of the bonds, which is the liability, is increasing as it gets closer to maturity. So what we want is we want that discount to start to go down to 0, the debit balance start to go down to 0. So if you look at the If you look at the liability, liability at June 30th was 91,892. At December 31st is 92,568. It's going up because the discount, the debit, is going down. Okay, and interest expense is also increasing as it gets closer to maturity. So there's two important concepts here. So if you issue a bond at a discount, you'll see that over time, over the 5-year period, the liability, the obligation gets larger and larger, and in fact it gets to 100,000 at maturity, because that was the face value of the bond. And you'll see that the interest expense will get larger and larger as well. We're going to see that next. So let's say we're asked to calculate the June 30th, 2012 interest entry. Okay, so let's say that was the next part of the question, is we're asked to calculate the interest for the June 2012. How do we calculate that? Well, first we need to calculate the carrying value from the last time interest was paid. In this case, the carrying value would be December 31st, 2011, because that was the last time interest was paid. Right? So to calculate the interest for the 6 month ending June, we have to figure out what our liability was as of December 2011. And that was bonds payable 100,000 less discounts on bonds payable. And the discount, we did calculate that, didn't we, is 7431.59 to give us the carrying value as at December 31st, 11. We're going to multiply this by the market rate of 8% times 1/2 again to give us interest expense of 3702. So our interest entry as of June is debit interest expense, the calculated amount, and you notice this number is actually greater than the December, the first period, right? So if you look at it, the interest is going up, isn't it? This was our December, this is now our June. It went up. We're going to credit cash always at 3,000, because remember, the stated rate is what dictates the amount paid, and the credit is discounts on bonds payable. And you notice that the amortized, or the discount, is getting, of course, larger and larger as it gets closer to maturity. Now, if we decided to use the straight line method, it's fairly simple actually under the straight line method. So under ASPE, as I mentioned earlier, that under ASPE, the straight line method can be used. So under straight line, method, we need to take the discount on bonds payable of 8107.30. We're going to divide it by the number of periods, which is 10. So the amortization is 810.73. And what we're going to do is we're going to recognize the interest. So the way it works is the interest entry, interest expense entry for any periods, right? So any periods, so for 10 of them, they're going to be the same entry. It's going to be debit, or in this case, we're going to credit interest, or sorry, cash, always at $3,000 because that's the amount that we're going to pay. We are going to credit discounts on bonds payable for the same amount, $810.73. And our interest expense is the same for the 10 periods. So for June 2012 or December 2012, June 2013, any of the 10 periods, the entry will be the same. You can see how this is the interest entry each period. And the reason why it's called straight line, it just means that the discount gets amortized over the straight line, over the 10 periods, the same amount each period. So the interest expense entry will be the same. Whereas the effective interest rate method will always have to calculate the carrying value of the bond multiplied by the market rate to determine the interest expense. And then the discount is the plug under the EIM method. Whereas under the straight line method, you actually calculate the amortized discount on bonds payable. And of course, the interest expense is the sum of what you pay plus the amortization of the discounts to determine the interest expense. And this is the entry that has to be recorded for the next 10 periods. Thank you.